calling Kala. And Nidhi. Hi everyone, I'm Anuradha, I'm Padma's daughter, and it's so lovely to see all of you. My heart is very full. So many friends from so many different parts of my life and her life are here today, and it's really an incredible moment for my father and for me. He's extremely grateful to all of you. So I'm standing here with some of my dear, dear friends, some of whom I've grown up with, and this may be a bit of a generational thing that we're about to do here. I guess some of us are middle-aged now. I tend to think of myself as permanently young, but that is not true. But this is definitely new to my father and mother, and probably some of our family members. But we'd like to open up with some acknowledgments, and these guys are here for my support. We're coming from many different places, experiences, times, but we've all arrived here at Columbia University today to celebrate this amazing woman, my mother. And, Columbia University has a history, and as does Manhattan, as does my mother, and the intersection of my mother's life and Columbia has been fascinating for me to grow up in. Especially because my mother grew up in colonial India. I grew up in the States believing it was important to remember how things were and how things have become the way they are. And so I'd like to give a brief land acknowledgement to the Lenape people who once inhabited this land, who were driven out by Dutch colonists and others. You will see reminders of their presence in many places, including in the name Manhattan, Mannahatta. I would also like to sort of formally welcome you to West Harlem. Some of us don't remember this is actually a very well-known Black American neighborhood that has been the foundation for culture that has spread throughout the country and the world. Always important to remember where we are building our buildings. I also want to recognize the ancestors who've recently passed and who've passed quite a while ago. Many of you have lost loved ones recently and long ago, and they are all here with us tonight with my mom. I want to recognize my elders, some of whom can no longer travel. Mota Masi, Chachi, Akka, Pravinkaka, Maltikaki. My mother's parents, Ba and Bapuji, and so many more. And I want to recognize, the elders among you. I know I'm a little younger than the aunties and uncles who are apparently distinguished economists, but you were always just uncle and auntie to me. So it's lovely to see many of you. I want to honor your presence here as well. Balbrikaka, Nilamasi. Cousins, you don't count. You're too young, even though I'm the youngest. And we were also coming off of Memorial Day weekend, which is a unique holiday in the United States, often known as a 3-day barbecue weekend for most of us. Some of you know that I was a military veteran, and so I like to just remember that this is a very heavy weekend for some. And I also like to remember that there are survivors of war and violence among us who never set foot in the military, and certainly have been in parts of the world that have been occupied by various militaries. And I want to recognize all of you and them today. Okay. I think we're good. Are we good? My mom was a really fun woman. She was also very serious. So that was serious. And now I really hope some of you share some fun stories, because some of us are wearing bright clothing in honor of her personality. And I know you all have bright hearts, so please, feel free to laugh. And please feel free to stretch, sit up, get up, be yourselves, be comfortable, do what your bodies need to do. I want to especially welcome the string quartet, who I think has been drawing crowds in from the campus. Tours have been coming in. These are some of my old friends and new friends as well. They're we're so lucky to have them. Sebastian, Raman, Peace, and Monica. So thanks, guys. First up, we have Mike Woodford.
So I'm Mike Woodford, the current chair of the Department of Economics here at Columbia, and I wanted to welcome you all on behalf of the university and the Department of Economics to this celebration of the life and career of Padma Desai. Padma, of course, was part of our department for more than 40 decades as the Gladys and Roland Harriman Professor of Comparative Economic Systems. She was also, since 1999, the director of the Center for Transition Economies here at Columbia. And for these many decades, I think she was really at the center of both the social and economic life of the department. I was very appreciative of the fact that when I first came here as a new assistant professor, she and Jagdish were the first people that invited me into their homes and made me feel a part of the community, and I've continued to value the occasions that I was able to see them since then. In terms of her contribution here, just one thing I wanted to mention, I think that it's quite possible that among the recent members, at least of our faculty, she was the person who taught and influenced the largest number of our students. And that was through her role as a long-standing instructor in our flagship course, Principles of Economics. And through that class, she was able to explain the nature and virtues of market economies and their value relative to the more planned economies that she was also an expert on, to several generations of students who have since become leaders in business, in the professions, in public life here in America. And it's been a really important contribution. Before we turn to the other speakers, I wanted to read some statements from people who are not able to be here today, but who did want to address you. The first of those is from Lee Bollinger, the president of the university. So Lee writes, in 2017, I had the privilege of awarding Padma Desai with the honorary degree of Doctor of Letters. I fondly remember standing with Padma on commencement day in front of thousands of graduating students and their families, friends, and loved ones. She asked me if she could take the podium to say a few words. Now, honorands don't normally speak at commencement, but it was Padma, and I was not going to deny her kind request. She took the opportunity to inform the gathered crowd that she was born in the backwaters of India and had come to the United States 60 years ago. She said that America was a great country and told the new graduates that they should travel around the world to see what it was like for people who lived in poverty. And she told them that if they were to make millions working on Wall Street in the future, they should give $1 million to Columbia University. That was the part that Lee particularly appreciated. She says, there was no one like Padma. The joy in her face, the connection with the audience, and the opportunity she seized to advocate for giving back to the vulnerable and less fortunate. She was a legendary economist, a global policymaker, a brilliant scholar, a beloved teacher, and a distinguished author. She was also a beloved Columbian for more than 4 decades, from the moment she joined the university community in 1980 until her death this year. On behalf of the entire university I extend my heartfelt condolences to her family, friends, and colleagues, and join with you all in celebrating her remarkable life and legacy. I also have a statement from Amy Hungerford, who is the Executive Vice President and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Amy writes, I regret that I am unable to join you for this meaningful tribute and memorial to Professor Padma Desai. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, where Professor Desai was a longtime member of the Economics Department, I want to express the deep sense of loss we feel today. Professor Desai's trailblazing scholarship, her perseverance in the face of both personal and professional challenges, and her absolute devotion to her students, her family, and to Columbia will long be an inspiration to us. Professor Desai's impact on those she taught, mentored, and engaged with as colleagues, and the influence of her ideas in the world as a prominent female economist represent an immense and special legacy for which we feel deep gratitude. We have lost a dear colleague, a great Columbian, a role model for women everywhere, and a powerful voice in the world. And finally, I wanted to read a message from Donald Davis, the Ragnar Nurksey Professor of Economics. Don is one of the people on our faculty who has known Padma for quite a while, and he was very disappointed that he was not able to be here. He's been on leave in Paris for the past few months and has not yet returned to New York, but he did want me to read a message to you. Dear Jagdish, Anuradha, colleagues, to Jagdish and Anuradha, I send my most heartfelt condolences on Padma's passing. Padma was a luminous figure, and I know that her presence will accompany you through your days. It grieves me not to be able to be there with you on this day for this memorial and celebration of her life. But when I am back in New York City, I will hope to sit with you and remedy this. As a PhD student at Columbia in the late 1980s, I never took a course from Padma. Jagdish was my teacher, mentor, and inspiration. But I did meet Padma, and in a very Padma-like fashion. The PhD students organized a series of lectures by favorite members of the faculty, and Padma generously accepted the invitation to meet with us. This would have been in the early 1990s, a period in which the verities of the world were turning on their head, precisely in the area of Padma's academic specialization, the transition from the planned economy of the Soviet Union to a more complex economy with elements of the market under the Russian Federation. I wasn't a specialist in the area, so don't recall all the details of her presentation. What I do remember very clearly is the authoritative nature of the presentation, the clarity of her arguments, and the detail with which she could support them. These she shared with an eager set of PhD students. Later, as a colleague, I could see as well the genuine pleasure she took in introducing lower division Columbia students to the principles of economics. She was a scholar, but she took seriously the task of passing on to the next generation what she had learned. When Padma turned 75, Columbia hosted a celebration of her life and work in Low Library with encomia by figures from both academic and political worlds. Among those offering praise were her teachers from Cambridge and lifelong friends, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow. Solow praised her scholarship as serious, but demurred on offering a deeper evaluation, not having sufficient depth in the area. I can do no more, since her field is obviously of great importance, but well outside my areas of specialization. One, though, need not be a specialist to see that she has focused on critical issues, been highly prolific, and considered by academic and political leaders in her area to be a must-read, whether they agreed or disagreed with any particular judgment. In the past week, I've had the great pleasure of reading again Padma's memoir, Breaking Out, An Indian Woman's American Journey. It is quite affecting, and if there is anyone at the memorial who has not read it, I heartily recommend it. I can't possibly summarize all that is there, so let me just make a few notes. It is rare for an economist to write with true literary style, although this seems to be universal in the Padma Desai family. But while Padma notes that some of the graduate students in her cohort suggested that she might do well as a film star, it is clear that if she had followed such a path, she could have also written the films and probably produced and distributed them as well. This undoubtedly has roots in her father, a Cambridge-educated professor of English literature who returned to teach in Surat, her native provincial Gujarati town. The firmness of the judgments she expresses and some of the challenges along the path may reflect the influence of her mother. The primary solace that she had as a youth, and some regrets on reflection, adhere to her kaki, her adoring and adored paternal aunt. I especially recommend my colleagues to read the chapter in Padma's memoir about Jagdish. Since he will be present, and because I want you to read her words, I will not try to extract the key events she recounts or review the texture of her language. We all know Jagdish, and so, on one level, little can come as a surprise. She was not a particularly religious woman, and in no mood to make Jagdish out to be a deity. But she does recount the story from their first meeting, a burgeoning friendship, the seeming impossibility of being together, a path of more than a decade before they could wed, and real sacrifices made to truly join their lives. Her Jagdish is one of utmost patience, untold devotion, and deepest love. We can't be surprised, but to see it in her words is to apprehend the quiet miracle in our midst. Padma would be the first to tell us that her life was not an uninterrupted string of successes. There were mistakes, there were regrets, both personally and professionally. A memorial gathering is, I think, a place for us all to reflect on how we would like to be remembered and judged. The subtitle of Padma's memoir is An Indian Woman's American Journey. In the spirit of reflection, we are obliged to think about that journey. How does a girl born into pre-independence India, growing up in a society then with only narrow paths for ambitious young women, find her way to Bombay University for college, Harvard for the PhD, and eventually to America and Columbia for the heart of her career? Padma's journey would have been impossible without unearthly determination. It would have been unfathomable without utter brilliance. And even so, for a young woman of this place and this time, it took some twists of fate, kismet perhaps, to open these paths. To be a woman pursuing a PhD at the top ranks in the 1950s was quite rare. To achieve this from her starting point, hardly imaginable. Padma was fond of using simple economics concepts to illustrate facts of daily life. And so I think it is appropriate to say that in evaluating her life, she would be pleased to rely on a value-added measure. And on a value-added basis, considering the challenges she faced and overcame, the arc of Padma's journey is nothing short of breathtaking. Let me again extend my condolences, above all, to Jagdish and Anuradha. We will miss Padma, and her journey will live on in our memories. So now, that's the written comments. I'd like to turn to the live speakers, and the first of our next speakers will be Professor Arvind Panagariya, the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy here at our School of International and Public Affairs.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Anuradha. Thank you, Jagdish. I had known Padma since about 1987, and that was actually the first time I visited Jagdish's place in Washington, D.C., where he was an advisor to Anne Kruger. Let me just say that to be the wife of Jagdish Bhagwati in a man's world and want to be known as Padma Desai was no ordinary challenge. But of course, Padma was no ordinary woman. Born with a razor-sharp intellect, iron will, and steely tenacity, she set out to break the mold, and so she did. Though she passed away on 28th April at age 91 in her New York City home, her example will live on, inspiring the future generations. What are the odds that a girl born in 1931 in the city of Surat in the state of Gujarat, in a conservative middle-class family, would take a boat halfway around the world to the United States of America at age of just 24 years. Yet that is what Padma did. First 10 days of journey brought her to France, where she got to meet Le Corbusier, the architect who had designed the city of Chandigarh in India, one of the most modern cities. She then proceeded to the New York City and thence to her final destination, Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In between, Padma had done her bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from Bombay University. In BA, she had stood first in the entire university, quite a rare thing for anybody. While studying, she also had a relationship with a man whom she married, but only to discover that this had been a huge mistake that would haunt her for the following 2 decades. Realization of that mistake led her to begin searching for fellowships for study in the United States. The first call with an offer came from the education minister of the then state of Bombay. It was a full 4-year fellowship for study at a leading women's college in the United States. But Padma turned it down, telling the minister that she wanted to go to a proper American university and compete with men. Her persistence paid, and the next offer was a fellowship from the American Association of the University Women, which opened the door to Harvard. Once at Harvard, Padma worked hard. Neither loneliness that inevitably came with foreign land, nor taunts by the sexist American men that economics was beyond her and that she should try out Hollywood instead, could dent her resolve. She completed her PhD in just 4 years, ahead of most of her classmates. In the interim, in 1956-57, good fortune brought Jagdish to Cambridge, Massachusetts, as a visiting student at MIT from Cambridge, England. The two met at a gathering in International Student Association, where Padma was serving chicken curry. It was love at first sight for Jagdish, and here I quote, "You were beautiful and were serving my favorite food," Jagdish confessed to her years later. Padma returned to India in May 1959 and told her disloyal husband of her decision to leave him. She spent the next decade fighting him unsuccessfully for a divorce. What made it all bearable was, of course, her own appointment as an associate professor at the Delhi School of Economics, which was then, of course, the prime institution. And without visiting that institution in those days, you really could not be a certified development economist. And then, of course, also, beginning in 1959, Jagdish returned to Delhi. He had already announced, of course, his intention to marry her. He first joined the Indian Statistical Institute, but then moved to the Delhi School of Economics in 1963. The two ended up with offices next to each other though the prospects of marriage remained distant in the absence of Padma's divorce. It was during these years that the duo began to write their magnum opus, Planning for Industrialization. To this day, there exists no work on Indian economy covering the years 1951 to 1968 that comes even close to this gem. It remains a model for meticulous assembly of the evidence, its critical examination, and systematic policy recommendations. The book made a powerful case in 1968 for the abolition of investment licensing in all but a few sectors, replacement of import licensing by tariffs, and a more flexible exchange rate regime. Though all these reforms and more were implemented in one stroke in 1991, at the time the book found virtually no takers. India was really in the grip of socialism in those days. With Padma's divorce nowhere in sight, she and Jagdish returned to move to the United States, where they eventually got married and were blessed with a daughter, Anuradha. Jagdish joined the economics faculty at MIT, and Padma became research associate at Harvard Russian Center. The two spent years 1968 to 80 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then moved to Columbia in New York City, where they remained. During approximately 5 decades between Harvard and Columbia, Padma had a burst of scholarly activity. She quickly emerged as one of the handful of leading experts on the Soviet, now Russian economy. Altogether, she published 70 professional articles and more than 15 books. As the collapse of the Soviet Union approached, she became one of the most sought-after speakers on the US television and, more broadly, Washington, New York lecture circuit. Challenging many leading scholars who had been advising Russia to transition from its centrally planned to a market economy on the back of a Big Bang reform, she advocated a more gradual approach. When her scathing critique of the Big Bang reforms led one defender of that view to retort that you cannot cross a wide chasm in 2 separate leaps, she shot back that you cannot do so in a single leap either unless you are Indiana Jones. So the wiser course is to drop a bridge. Padma's specialization on Russian economy was not an accident. She had begun learning Russian during her days as a student at Harvard to fulfill her long-standing ambition to read Dostoevsky in the original, which she did. She could speak Russian fluently and sometimes embarrassed her co-passengers in an elevator in Moscow by suddenly revealing that she could follow their snide remarks. 3 days before she passed away, when her hospice care happened to send a Ukrainian nurse, she entered a 45-minute-long conversation in Russian with her. That was Padma at her best, relentless till the end. До свидания, Padma. We shall miss you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm a professor of political science and a former director of the Harriman Institute. I will always also be a student of Padma Desai's. Padma was a cherished and indispensable member of the Harriman Institute faculty for over 40 years. As holder of the distinguished Harriman Chair, she was an extraordinary economist, author, commentator, and interviewer. Padma brought scores of interesting and important guests to Harriman and Columbia through her many contacts in Russia. She represented Harriman at home and abroad in quite diverse fora as panelist, moderator, discussant, including appearing regularly on the McNeil-Laird NewsHour program. In 2014, she kindly gave permission to the Harriman magazine to run an excerpt from her memoir, Breaking Out, and then she contributed to the Institute's Oral History, Cold Wars, and the Academy in 2016. Her lifelong engagement with Russia and the former Soviet Union was a journey that openly embraced the country's economy, the language, the culture, and everything else. And as we've heard, as Padma writes in her memoirs, that began, her Russian discovery was motivated by her love for Russian language and literature, and yes, indeed, Dostoevsky seems to have been the culprit. She recounts in her oral history, when I read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I was completely unnerved. I couldn't sleep. And my mother was worried. And as I said to myself, I'm going to read this in Russian. I have to read this in Russian. At Harvard, Padma recollects, my knowledge of Russian led me then not just to read Russian literature in the original, but to use it to do research on the Russian economy. It gave me a great advantage, as few economists specializing on the Russian economy knew the language. More recently, she may have been the only Harriman faculty member, or any faculty member I know, to be a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations and PEN American Center, the writers' organization. Her intellectual range was just extraordinary. But perhaps there is an additional consideration here. Padma recounts in her oral history grappling with the question of, quote, how we women need to develop our own persona to find our true selves. She continues, moving into my own field of specialization, Russian studies, would guarantee that no one could even seriously allege that my husband was helping me. His knowledge of the Russian language and the Russian economy is not something to write home about. Sorry, Jagdish. Later, as Padma engaged with the upheavals caused by economic reforms in post-Soviet Russia, we were taken into the Russian world in her masterpiece, Conversations on Russia, Reform from Yeltsin to Putin, which was published by Oxford in 2006. One is immediately struck by her wide-ranging nature of these conversations and the diverse cast of interviewees, ranging from Chubais and Gaidar, the late Boris Nemtsov, to Martin Malia and Richard Pipes, historians of Imperial Russia. It is no surprise that the Financial Times selected Padma's Conversations as a top pick for 2006. This extraordinary range was hardly surprising to those of us who knew her. I took her class as a graduate student at Columbia on the post-Soviet economic transition in the mid-1990s, and it was transformative. Padma encouraged me to think about the human and social costs of economic reforms, not just blueprints and designs, about the unprecedented scale of what was happening in Russia and the entire region, and presciently about the real potential for unintended political backlash in this critical region. Padma was a constant inspiration and guide in my own 3 decades journey across the post-Soviet region. When I became director of the Harriman Institute in 2015, I was overjoyed to learn that the Institute has established a Padma Desai Summer Fellowship, thanks to a generous gift from Padma and Jagdish. The fellowship has supported travel and living expenses for summer research, travel, language learning, internship opportunities for undergraduates and graduate students whose interests include Russia and/or Soviet studies. It is the Harriman Institute's great pleasure to honor Padma's legacy by selecting the brightest and most committed students of the region with this fellowship, and to ensure that they continue to travel, learn about, engage locally, even in our current times of conflict, crisis, profound human tragedy, and upheaval. It is just my greatest honor to celebrate Padma's remarkable contributions to our field, and to thank her for her inspiration, her mentorship, her candor, intellectual honesty, bravery, and clarity, for her insistence to demand both rigor and critical thinking, and for pushing all of us to search for what lies far beyond these boundaries that we once took as given. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. Thank you, Jagdish. I'm Dan O'Flaherty. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics. I have knew Padma for around 30 years before the pandemic, and for many years my office was next to hers on one side or the other. I never once saw her angry or tired or not in control. Even after she was 80, she was always working on projects in the office, taking little breaks to get some tea and change around her tea bags. The tea bags were when I saw her most often. The tea breaks were when I saw her most often. A smile, a joke, a few words, generally of encouragement. In the years of the pandemic, there were lots of things that I missed that I did not mind missing. But on the top of the list of things that I minded missing were the times that I would run into Padma or Jagdish and have a few words with them and talk about what was going on. When I started teaching in person again after the pandemic, the department office, 1022 IAB, didn't feel right without Padma there. I was waiting for her to come back, so I'm afraid that 1022 IAB will continue to feel askew for me. Jagdish and Anuradha asked for a celebration of life, and that's what Padma would have wanted. So let me talk about why I was lucky to have known Padma. Padma delighted in teaching. Sunil and I also teach principles, and we often talked about it with Padma. Padma said that principles gave her some chance to appear on a stage and command an audience, the same chance that she would have had she pursued a career in theater or Hollywood instead of economics. As we've heard before, I wasn't aware that her colleagues in graduate school said that she should go to Hollywood. They didn't think she should go into economics, but she went into economics and was massively successful. At the same time, she continued to be an artist. And so she got 2 instead of what they thought was at most 1. Padma taught me in other ways too, not just about teaching, ways that were much quieter. Let me talk about one of those lessons, an aspect of her thought and personality that was mentioned only briefly by President Bollinger, but it made an impression on me. Padma was an American, and she loved being an American. Because she was Padma, she could think clearly about why she loved America, and because she was Padma, she could explain her reasons clearly too, much more clearly than I can. Her memoirs make this obvious, as does her statement at the convocation that President Bollinger recounted. Her memoir, the title talks about an American journey, which is very important to Padma. Now, I grew up in New Jersey, as everyone who knows me knows. And so to me, being an American was like having opposable thumbs, something that had considerable use, but something I never had to make decisions about or think much about. If I write memoirs, the title probably won't mention opposable thumbs. Padma grew up in India and studied Russian, and so she had a different perspective. To her, as I remember it, America was about possibilities, the ability to live a life that no one in your family imagined you could do, to do things that had never really been done before, to put together all aspects of life in different ways, to use all your talents, whether mathematical or cultural, no matter who you were. Padma knew that she and Jagdish were and are exceptional, but she saw many other people in America, immigrants and natives alike, taking advantage of many of these same possibilities. The subtitle is An Indian Woman's American Journey. It's just an Indian woman. It's not an extraordinary American woman. It's not the only American journey. It's just something that other people can do and have done. And that was a lot of how she thought about it. Padma saw the possibilities of American lives, the possibilities that matter to her in the dynamism of the economy and the dynamism of the culture. This came up often in my conversations with her. Padma wasn't a fool, of course, and as we've heard many times, she had ridden too many elevators to think that America was perfect. But she was a persistent optimist. She continued working quietly quietly refilling her teacup as long as she could. Padma let me understand how lucky I was to be an American, and that was what she told me explicitly. And for that, I am grateful. But she forgot to point out that I'm also lucky to have experienced the very best that America has to offer. To be friends with Jagdish and Padma, and by extension, Anuradha. My colleagues over the years have been blessed similarly. That friendship is something that is very much worth celebrating, and I am thankful to everyone who gathered here today to help me celebrate that friendship and that extraordinary family. Thank you.
Is Gayatri here? Not yet. Professor Krugman?
Well, I want to actually start by apologizing to Anuradha, who urged us all to wear something colorful. And I went and looked in my wardrobe and discovered that aside from cycling jerseys, I had a range of colors of shirts that ranged from light blue to dark blue, and of suits that ranged from gray to navy, which says something about me, but also maybe about economists. So apologies on that. I didn't know Padma well. I wish I very much regret that now. I was Jagdish's student and briefly colleague, so much of what I know, to the extent I knew her personally, was all through Jagdish. I do want to give a shout out to Jagdish, who started a lifelong fascination with international economics, which has certainly served me well, and I hope led to some things that other people found interesting. And I am not, partly for not having known her well personally, and partly because other people can do it far better, in a position to talk much about the life story, except that her life story is extraordinary, and it's a life story that's intertwined with a love story, which is extraordinary. So here, to Padma's memory, to Jagdish, as much as an economist who owns only gray suits can do, let me try to express my admiration and appreciation for all of that. One thing that becomes clear that as we've been listening to all of these remembrances is that Padma was a woman who took roads less traveled. But had an uncanny instinct for finding less traveled roads that led to really, really interesting destinations. And obviously that's true of her whole life story, of coming from the background she did and ending up here and becoming an American in the way that, as other speakers have said, only somebody who wasn't born here really can be. Russia, something that people who are not economists of a certain age might not know is that Padma's decision to learn Russian, become an expert on Russia, occurred at almost perfectly out of sync with what was happening in much of the profession. There used to be a substantial amount of what we called area studies in economics. People who really knew something about a particular country or a particular group of countries and then did economic analysis. And that was very, very much going out of fashion, just as Padma Desai was transforming herself into a Russia expert, which turns out to, aside from being an incredibly wonderful thing, and my God, how many economists are inspired in their field choice by love of literature? How many economists even know what literature is? But also turns out to have been enormously strategic because now she was, if you go back, I've been reading a lot of a small fraction of, but as much as I could of Padma's writings, and she was among the early people to point out that the Soviet economy was really running aground, to be aware that this was not sustainable, and then was positioned to be someone who could speak with genuine understanding, expertise during the era of the transition economies, which is, if I can say again, for economics, this was not one of the profession's finest hours. A lot of us marched in to these newly post-socialist economies with a combination of arrogance and ignorance, thinking that we knew what to do, what they should do, having really no sense at all of the cultures or the political environment in which they were entering. And Padma actually knew. On the most important of the transition economies, she actually knew a lot about the country, knew a lot about the culture, had a very good sense of the politics. That book, it's a huge list of publications, books to read, all of them very much worth it. But certainly the most cited work at this point is her mid-2000s conversations regarding Russia. Both, if you don't have time for the whole book, the summary paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives from 2005 is in itself a quite remarkable piece. Remarkable in part because she did something that economists tend not to do, which is to actually talk to people and learn something about the society on which she was writing. But it's a story of a very important story. It's a story of a tragedy. It's basically a story of how reform went so badly astray, how the attempt to make the transition into being a fully normal part of the world and the world economy went astray. And she talked to the reformers and their issues, and it should be must reading because such issues have not gone away. And as it turns out, it concludes the JEP Journal of Economic Perspectives piece concludes with some discussion of the political economy, with some rather downbeat speculations on the future of political liberalism in the aftermath of this rather disastrous attempt at economic reform, which when power had recently been assumed by a guy named Vladimir Putin. And reading that now, it's extraordinarily prescient about the risks to the future. So it's an extraordinary career. I had not actually, to be honest, until I began to do my homework for this event, fully appreciated just what an incredible journey Padma Desai took. I'm honored to be asked to speak at this memorial. I think we should all honor her memory and look at what she did and think of, ask yourself, could you have done that? I think the answer for every one of us is no. But how can we get more people to do that, to show that kind of courage and boldness in forging new paths? A great life, a great legacy, and again, special wishes, best wishes to my old teacher and brief colleague, Jagdish Bhagwati. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Spivak, whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you for asking me, Anuradha. I am deeply honored. I'm sorry to be late. At our age, there are certain kinds of appointments that one can't miss, not even to celebrate. Can you hear me? Not even to celebrate the death of a dearly beloved and respected person, Padma Desai, and her extraordinary life, an examined life, a teaching and learning life, a life of bold engagement, capable of great and loving joy, and acutely analytic of sorrow, has come to an end. It is possible that my experience of life resembled hers enough that I'm peculiarly able, with a certain degree of objectivity, to undertake its celebration. I could not match her tremendous intelligence, but shared the absolute obsession with a life of thinking. I'm not that much younger than she. It was a strange commitment for women at that point in time. A life of thinking. I cannot match her relentless honesty, but share her faith in the power given by turning a critical eye upon oneself. I must also mention fighting with the boys without seeming to, a hard task, and many battles our generation have and had to fight at home and abroad. In my inadequate judgment, I felt a certain vulnerability in her, perhaps I was wrong, which I certainly also feel in myself. Fierceness and passion is what Anuradha thought I shared with her. I cannot tell you how complimented I felt with that remark, for I was always in awe of her. This I think Jagdish knew. I was in awe of her. She had come a longer way than I and achieved more. Soviet economics, I mean, you just heard the tribute from the discipline. Soviet economics, a near-native command of Russian, whereas I dragged on with the usual Britlit. When I read in her autobiography, Breaking Out, that her father had taught British literature, I felt some relief. I'm not sure why. I also read that she had wanted to do Russian because of Dostoevsky. I wanted her to explain that desire to me, to, quote, amplify that sentence, as the question papers would say in the extensive Indian state exams we both took in our adolescence. Amplify this comment. Literature pervaded her understanding of her own life. She enters the final chapter of her autobiography by way of Chekhov and Turgenev. I still wanted her to amplify her connection to Dostoevsky and making a life decision on it. And I'm sorry, I frankly did not have the courage to ask. I have spoken of her relentless honesty now twice. Two areas where this honesty shone forth was becoming American and becoming academic. Indeed, in these days, and I know this well, of the spurious identity politics of the diaspora, her acute analysis of becoming American is deeply instructive, especially in the area of exceptionalism. Equally, her analysis of how an Indian female prospers in the US Academy is instructive and sometimes exhilarating. Prosper she did, an unquestioned authority. Once again, of this, her disciplinary colleagues are able to speak. I haven't the skill. If our academic lives had not been so busy, I think we could have been friends. We admired each other. And as it happened, she was among the very few people at the university from whom I accepted advice. At one of our infrequent meetings, she had scolded me about my intellectual insecurity because she had understood that it was real. See, this is hard to understand, those of us who have battled so much and achieved some kind of a toehold. This is hard to understand, but Padma was right there. Because she understood that it was real, it came out of her utter unsentimentality, coupled with a depth of sympathy that came stringently tested. It is not hard to celebrate the luminous being that was Padma Desai. All our words, I hope so far, since I came in late, and those who will speak after me, have given and will give witness. Thank you.
Dear friends and family, today I stand here before you to celebrate the life of our beloved Padma Kaki, the Gujarati term for my father's younger brother, Jagdish Bhagwati's wife. Padma Kaki was big-hearted and always there for her family, especially her feisty nieces, for whom she was a feminist role model. She encouraged many of us to move to the United States to study and experience the same magical awakening she had at Harvard. After following her advice at 18, she welcomed me as her own daughter and continued to be a second mother well into my late 50s. When I lost both parents, Padma Kaki stepped right in to say that my sister and I were not orphaned as long as she and Jagdish Kaka were around. She always welcomed family visiting from India with open arms and treated them to a feast of her exquisite culinary skills. Her salmon, prepared with special Indian spices, was unparalleled and simply to die for. According to family folklore, Padma Kaki's courtship with Jagdish Kaka was the stuff of romance novels. They were a true partnership, and their love for each other was evident in everything they did. My Kaki was a stickler for her Nordic track and her healthy eating, and she would often forbid my uncle from eating certain foods. Jagdish Kaka was a master of sneaking forbidden food behind her back. But no matter how hard he tried, Padma Kaki always found out. It was like she had a sixth sense about him. She would give him a stern look and say, "I know exactly what you're up to." But instead of getting angry, she would patiently explain to him why it was important to eat healthy. Jagdish Kaka would nod vigorously in agreement, but secretly he was already planning his next food heist. As you all know, Padma Kaki was a rare combination of beauty and brains. In fact, her beauty was so striking that even Hollywood heartthrobs couldn't resist her. It was at the 1994 Soccer World Cup in LA, to which my Kaki and Sunil had invited me. We were at a post-game cocktail where Gregory Peck saw her in an elegant sari and made a beeline for her. Kirk and Michael Douglas soon followed. Of course, my Kaki, being the humble person she was, never bragged about it. But we all knew the truth, as did Jagdish Kaka, who stood there agape and chuckling as he watched these handsome hunks encircle his lovely wife. Padma Kaki was not only a beautiful and intelligent woman, but she was also a legendary professor. Her classes were known to be some of the best on campus, and her students would often rave about her lectures. She often recalled mischievously how some of her students compared her to the other Indian economics professor, completely oblivious that he was none other than her dear husband. Padma Kaki too had a reputation for being kind and generous to her students. I happen to know one of her Indian students quite well, who often narrates the story of how she brought him home to Lexington, Massachusetts for the winter when he had nowhere else to go. Many of her students went on to achieve great things, and they credited my Kaki for helping them get there. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the one thing that brought Padma Kaki the most pride and joy: her daughter Anuradha, our baby cousin. Despite Anu being born later in her life, Padma Kaki always prioritized her above anything else. We used to watch in secret delight as she sparred with Jagdish Kaka, making sure that Anu always emerged victorious in any argument with her father. She was Anu's biggest cheerleader when she joined the Marines and supported her in all her endeavors. She gifted Anu's book, Unbecoming, to everyone she knew, eager to share her daughter's literary talent with the world. Anu, you were the light of her life, and she was always so proud of the person you've become. Padma Kaki's passing has left a void in our hearts, but we take comfort in knowing that she is now at peace. We will always cherish our shared memories with love and laughter and hold them close to our hearts forever. Om Shanti.
So I met Professor Desai, and it's Professor Desai for me, although my kids and wife called her Padma along the way. It's always been Professor Desai for me. And we met in 1981, which was also a year where her niece was staying with the family for a couple of years. But I didn't really get to know her until a year or two later. And I don't know if it was when I first TA'd for her, and there's 2 or 3 people in the room that were TAs for her back then, or when I first babysat Anuradha, sorry. We have to own up to that. And one of the first and fond memories I have, it's not in the babysitting years, it was a little bit later, we went to the movies. Anuradha, Professor Desai, and I went to the movies, and we ran into a teenage girl who was wearing an interesting outfit. And we'll just leave it at that. And she turned to Anuradha, who would have been, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 at the time, and said, "If you ever wear something like that, I will kill myself," which seemed like a strong threat at the time. Anuradha, like my daughter, decided not to wear those sorts of outfits until she left the house and changed later, which pleased Professor Desai, I'm sure. No one so far surprisingly mentioned that in one of the pictures, it's a beautiful picture at an anniversary or birthday that David Bloom and Lakshmi Bloom were hosting. The professors, Professor Bhagwati and Professor decided to renew their vows, except these vows in India apparently involve walking around a fire. To do that indoors when you have really long hair led to exactly the outcome you would have predicted with this story. Her hair was on fire. She took a lot of things in stride, some other things not so much in stride. This she took remarkably in stride. In that conference honoring her some years ago, she asked me to MC the event. And I said, "Well, what does the MC do?" She said, "Oh, just introduce people, and you have to read some letters." And I said, "Okay, who are the letters?" "What kind of letters?" She said, "Well, there'll be a letter from Paul Samuelson and a letter from Robert Solow." And I was hesitating. She goes, "Perhaps you've read something by them previously," which luckily I had. The teas were mentioned. For several years, the university and School of International Affairs had these things called Dean's Tea. And it was teas and cookies on the 6th floor. We went almost every day. And we talked about things that we don't normally talk about if I were in her office. But literally almost every day at 4 o'clock, she would knock on my door or I would knock on hers. We'd go down and talk quite often about, yes, you, Professor Bhagwati, and some things that we haven't talked about that I'll address sometime soon with you. Lots of times about Anuradha and what it was like to try to manage a teenage daughter in America. And we're not the same age, but I was sort of in between the two. And it's at one of those times, it was the serious side of her. I had gone to her with well, not a problem, but a story of a painful heartache that I'd gone through. And she wasn't in her forgiving mood. She wasn't being very sentimental that day. And she said, "Buck up." Not, "It'll be okay, you'll find someone, just buck up." That was relieved because apparently she passed that story on to Anuradha, who was 15 years my junior at the time, and at the time would have been 12 or 13. And Professor Desai came to me 2 days later. She said it's going to be okay because I talked to Anuradha, and she said, "Oh, I'll marry Sunil if no one else will." It worked out, Anu. Marcella's here. Let's keep it. When I was at the World Bank in the Young Professionals Program, I was going to work on Africa, but inside it was 1991, and decided to work for a while on the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Soviet Union was breaking up, but I knew nothing about the Soviet. I knew a lot about their soccer team, but nothing else. So I called her and said, "Listen, I'm going to Moscow. I need to know some things about the Russian economy." She said, "Okay, when are you leaving?" And I said, "Tuesday," and this was previous Wednesday. She goes, "Oh, Sunil." And those were 2 of her favorite words with me. And the others were, "I'm hanging in," and I'll come back to that. And I said, "Well, okay, but I've got to learn something." She goes, "If you're leaving on Tuesday, just try to memorize the names of the 15 republics and the capitals, because that's all you're going to be able to do between now and then." I'm not sure if I accomplished that, but on this trip, in the first week, we had a meeting. The mission was led by Larry Summers, and we had a meeting with the Minister of Economy, Gaidar, at the time. "Oh, this is going to be impressive. I can go back and tell Professor Desai about this." So after we came back, I called her, and I was in Washington. She was here in New York. I said, "Listen, we had a meeting with Prime Minister, who become Prime Minister Gaidar, and Larry Summers was leading the mission." She said, "Yes, but do you know the names of the capitals yet?" Not forgiving at all. On the way back from a mission that I was on with the World Bank in Moldova, a young woman from the economics department, an administrator, passed away. and she was in her late 20s, her early 30s, and this was the serious side. And I stopped in New York so I could attend the service in this chapel, as did Professor Desai. And there was an opportunity to speak at the end of the ceremony for people that weren't on the list but wanted to say something. And I didn't have the stomach, frankly, the courage to get up and speak about this woman, Marta Torres, who was a lovely, lovely woman. We're talking about 1992. Professor Desai spoke eloquently, got Martha's spirit perfectly, and there'll be a couple people in the room that will remember her, to the point where after the ceremony, her parents, who were here, talked to Professor Desai and talked about how they had been so moved by her words. She got Marta just perfectly right. And that World Cup story, there's a little correction I need to make to two of the stories. First is President Bollinger's letter, and I'll come back to that one in a minute, but let's address the World Cup. I did invite them out to the World Cup, professors and Katie came, and she found out that Henry Kissinger was on our board of directors. And I was working at the World Cup, so I had some real responsibilities on the day of the World Cup final. And now one of them became try to keep her apart from Henry Kissinger, because I was concerned that she would spend at least 15 minutes telling him how he had gotten everything about the Soviet Union wrong over the last 20 years. That Michael Douglas meeting was not an accident. I asked him to distract her, and it worked, so that worked out perfectly. Commencement. I would never, under normal circumstances, correct anything President Bollinger has said or would say, but he's leaving, so we can say something. So I've been to one commencement in 42 years of being in and around Columbia, and I went with my wife. One commencement, including when I've gotten degrees, other honorary speakers, when my son graduated. One commencement. It's when she got her honorary degree. And you sit here on the low steps a few rows behind. And my wife had said, well, what's going to happen? She's going to get an honorary degree, but does she talk? I said, nope, they don't speak. She said, okay. So we're sitting, it's warm out, and all of a sudden Professor Desai gets up to go and accept the degree, and she's looking like she's not going to stop. And my wife said to me, what is she doing? I said, there's no way he's going to let her speak. She goes, well, I said, he's got no chance. And he had no chance. And the reaction from the students gathered was exactly, President Bollinger got that part absolutely right. It was fantastic. A long, hot day, an additional speaker, and her words were terrific. In the last few months, I visited with 25 Claremont quite a bit. And a lot of times in that period, I would ask Professor Desai how she was doing. And she would say, I'm hanging. And she was saying that even a little bit earlier. And if she got a little bit more ill, she would say that, and it became more silent and so on. So the last few times I went to 25 Claremont, not just announce myself, but I would go to her and hold her hand and saying, it's Sunil. And she knew, and the last time I was there, which was 2 days before she passed, and I wasn't going to be there the next day because I was away, when I clasped her hand, she grabbed my hand and kissed my hand. And I don't know if she had an inkling or knew I wasn't going to be there the next day, but it said a lot about her and our relationship over a long period of time. But I couldn't possibly end my comments talking about my relationship with her, which was very special and very important. It would have to really end with Anuradha and Professor Bhagwati. And the one line, and I went back and reread like Don Davis did her memoirs, and the one line that was most striking to me was, quote, the sole miracle in my life. The sole miracle in my life. And she's talking about Anuradha. And I can assure you that, and Anuradha knows it, there were many things over 40 plus years of having a miracle in your life that she didn't agree with, didn't potentially approve of, some that she didn't even accept. But boy, did she adore you. She said it a lot. I don't know how often she said it to you, but she said it to me plenty of times, including on trips to New Haven where things may not have been going as planned or decisions you have made. And if she could have seen fully the last few months, and she certainly saw that, of you being back and managing the household. And by the way, for those of you that know the academic side or the outside, she ran the place. It wasn't 50-50. Trust me on that. It wasn't 50-50. but she adored you. And Professor Bhagwati, I've heard now 2 or 3 people mention it was love at first sight. Now, no one has said it was both of them were love at first sight. And when we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, Professor Bhagwati mentioned for him it had been love at first sight. To his credit, he did not claim it was love at first sight for her at a time where I could no longer confirm that. So thank you for that, for being honest about it. A couple of 3 months ago, she had been in the hospital for a few days. And I happened to be there when she was released. And she was on her bed, and Professor Bhagwati's in the room. 6 months after a marriage, 6 years, yeah, 10 years, maybe. This was 60 years into a relationship, and this was teenagers. This was teenagers. It was absolutely extraordinary. Now, my wife and I got married a little bit later, so we won't likely have 60 years together. But boy, if I could describe that, and I took a couple of pictures and sent it to a couple of the nieces, if you could see what it was like for him and what it was like for her to be back together after a few days' absence, boy, we'd all wish for that. We'd all wish for that with a partner in life, 60 years plus later. So, what would Professor Desai say if she was here? She might ask a question, or she might have a statement and a question. She might say, "Oh, Sunil, I did a lot more than hang in, didn't I? We'll miss you."
Thank you, everyone. My heart's still full. I wanted to start by saying, the audacity of my mother at the commencement ceremony. We all have something to add. The other honorees were legends in their field. We had a legendary French chef who my father would watch every Saturday, Sunday on PBS, desperately trying to replicate his recipes. That was Jacques Pepin, yes? And then the two that I was particularly in awe of standing next to my mother were Admiral Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff years ago. And as a former Marine officer, it was like standing next to a god, right? And he was a very progressive guy who helped to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So my mother grabbed the microphone before Admiral Mullen. That was badass. Also Eric Holder, some of us may have heard of him. These guys had nothing on my mom, just nothing. I was so excited. I was completely embarrassed, as always, and also extremely proud of her. I want to read a letter by Ron Leibowitz, who is a colleague to some of you, such a personal letter. He was a student of my mother's and also currently president of Brandeis University in the Boston area and was president of Middlebury College, and he couldn't be here and was just, many of you have alluded to this, but my mother and father adopt all of you, essentially. If you're even a year younger, you're like another child, and so, for better or worse, but Ron was kind of like another child for my mom, I think. So here we go. I'm honored to have Anuradha share this message. I can still recall with a broad smile the many days I saw 7-year-old Anuradha and Jagdish walking down Broadway to the Bank Street School, hand in hand, deep in conversation, as I was walking up Broadway to campus from my apartment on 109th Street. I met Padma during my second year at Columbia. I was a PhD student in the erstwhile geography department and the then Russian, now Harriman Institute. We met when I heard from other graduate students that an economics professor was looking for research assistants to provide support for a project she was undertaking on the variability of Soviet grain production. Coincidentally, I had already registered for Padma's course on Soviet economics, and despite not being a student in the economics department, I had majored in economics as an undergraduate, and the geography and economics departments shared the 10th floor of the International Affairs Building, and so I thought the stars were aligning for me to land the assistantship. During our interview, which I remember as if it were yesterday, we talked about many things. Most germane to the research position, we delved deeply into Soviet geography, planned economies, the impact of Trofim Lysenko's ideological approach to science and how it set back Soviet agriculture and food production many decades, Russian cuisine, terrible Russian cuisine, plus many other things. Padma's demeanor during that first meeting, warm, calm, and intensely inquisitive, was how I would come to know her for the 3 years we worked together, including her service on my dissertation committee. I'd had humble, open, and loyal to my list of initial descriptors. I was able to juggle my relationship with Padma as a research assistant and student, mostly, I now understand, due to how Padma handled things. Although geography is taught brilliantly in the Indian educational system, and Padma knew her geography, there was a lot to learn about Soviet geography. The USSR did occupy 11 time zones. If one were to understand why Soviet grain production evolved as it did, why crops were planted where they were, and why there was such variability in production from year to year. The focus of Padma's research. And although I studied economics as an undergraduate, there was a lot to learn about planned economies if one wanted to understand the motivation of Soviet planners for where they invested capital across the massive, multi-ethnic state, which was my dissertation topic. In a short amount of time, it was clear we forged a true academic partnership. I shared my knowledge of things like why winter and spring wheat required different climatological conditions, and why precipitation was far more unpredictable in Kazakhstan than I am really not an economist, but I also am not an expert on this area, so here we go. Then the Chernozem zone of southern Russia and Ukraine, and she tried her best to get me through production function, mathematics in her graduate seminar, which required more one-on-one tutoring than I would like to admit or recall. Padma completed that grain study, along with many other research projects, articles, and books, including her brave autobiography, for which she has received well-deserved acclaim. But for all she did to bring recognition to herself as a scholar, it was her work with students and her commitment to each and every one of us that is such an important part of her rich legacy at Columbia. I remember having to sit outside her office to speak with her because there were 4, 5, or 6 students regularly waiting to see her. And our conversations showed me a deep humility that taught me how a faculty member might share one's expertise while encouraging students to challenge and take risks in putting forth their views. Padma's style of engaging her students prepared me well for my own career as a teacher and scholar. Fast forward a good 25 years. As president of Middlebury College in Vermont, I was privileged to award Padma an honorary degree for her lifetime achievements as a scholar of the Soviet and post-Soviet world. Prior to the commencement ceremony, honorees hold sessions with students and their families to discuss their careers and answer questions. It was watching that meeting, and specifically how Padma reframed questions to draw in the graduating seniors and their family members, where I most clearly saw how much Padma and Jagdish contributed to my and my fellow PhD students' education way beyond our disciplines. She never dodged a question or follow-up, and drew some remarkable observations from an audience she didn't know. It reminded me of dinners at her and Jagdish's apartment, which included wide-ranging conversations about Mughal art, brain drain from the non-aligned world, state socialism as a challenge to liberalism, the roots of mercantilism, Reaganomics. This was the early 80s, and so much more. The great support I had in my own department was enriched by this most dedicated, challenging, humble, and above all, caring academic who so naturally made my time at Columbia what any and every graduate student could only hope for. Padma, on behalf of so many of us who studied with you, argued with you, and explored big and small ideas with you, I convey to you a simple but heartfelt and most appreciative thank you. You were and are a gift to your family, to Columbia, and to scores of students who have benefited from your intelligence and generosity of spirit. So I'd like to say a few words about my mom. And I thought I'd speak from the heart, which is a good place to start. My mom was an enigma to me for most of my life, and I didn't really know why until much later. I think part of the reason was she was working round the clock with all of you, writing, researching. She was such a serious student. She was a serious student when she was 6 years old. I've heard legendary stories about her studentness from her family in India. They were so proud of her. And, I think I visited her village in India, her town in India now, and it's a very traditional place in a lot of ways. Bakul, you may disagree with me. I really remember, though, the times I spent with her mother, who was brilliant, smarter than any person in the room, any man in the room, could hold forth with anyone, but was never given the opportunity to go to school, never learned to read and write, even though she had a natural gift in so many ways. Similarly, my mother, grew up in a very conservative household, and to imagine her here in New York City it really blows my mind. She grew up in colonial India, right? My uncle's, Ketki's father was busy helping to overthrow the British Empire at the time, when my mom was a teen. And it's a remarkable history that we can even our relatives were part of all of that. And somehow she made it here. She made it here through a scholarship, a feminist scholarship. Let's call it what it is, right? Women who are looking out for women around the world, who wanted to encourage them to pursue scholarship. And my mom was that young woman. I think she shocked her family in a lot of ways, just like I shocked my mom and dad in a lot of ways. I take after my mom. She was feisty. She would not. She did what she wanted to do in a lot of ways, even back then in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And when I first heard about her first marriage to an abusive husband, it again blew my mind. It was like I was living a soap opera. I didn't quite believe it. And as I grew older and faced my own challenges in school, on the streets of New York, in the subways, with relationships, friends, learning what it was like to be a brown girl in a mostly white country, I really began to appreciate her. And it was leaving her husband, which some of the speakers alluded to, which was the most badass thing I can imagine a woman of her age doing. It's inconceivable. Women in that time did not get divorces in India. Even today, it is looked down upon in some way. And for her to basically escape an abusive marriage, using her wiles, because it wasn't easy. Hinduism at that time prevented her from doing that, right? So she's stuck with this abusive partner. She went across the ocean on a feminist scholarship, met my dad, right? So at some point they were living in sin, which is a phrase maybe that doesn't even exist anymore. I don't know, Sophie, is it a thing? And started this new life. So they weren't even married until I was born, it's crazy. It's crazy. She tested her parents. I think she set an example that was so resounding. It was so radical. It was such a departure from the norm for all of her peers, for her nieces, for her nephews, for sure, for the next generation. I mean, the woman's a goddess. It really, when I think of all the feminist icons I have read and learned, Professor Spivak, you're one of them, really. I mean, my mother was doing that in her life. And so her scholarship, which I know a lot less about than all of you, I was never interested in economics. So, sorry, Dad. It sounds extraordinary, but I was the one who was more interested in literature and music, and my mom was a musician, and she was, the first time I saw her dance, she was dancing at Swati's wedding, Nilamasi. That was the first time I saw my mother dance. Can you believe it? I had never seen her dance. I was like, there's a side to this woman I want to discover, right? So I'm like looking at old pictures these last few months, and I see pictures of her skiing and dancing with locals in Kazakhstan, and she was a little rebel. She was, and I look at you, Smita, and Roma, Buck, all of you, Ketki, just like Sophie. She's just rooting for you. She was like rooting for you, even before you knew what you wanted to be and do with your life. She just rooted for young women and young men. She just believed in a better world. And she grew up in such a poor area, where still girls cannot go to school in many parts of India, face so many barriers, are married off when they're 12 or 13, And those are the girls she fought for the entire time. Like she saw all of us in those girls, and all those girls she saw such potential. And that's who she was. That's who my mom was. And Dan, when you were talking about how she never got angry, during her tea breaks, and she was always sort of collected, and I thought that's so fascinating. It's like she was really. We never really talked about this. I think she was too old to really get into the details, but she was a really good code switcher. She was really sophisticated. Like she figured out the Ivy League. She figured out sort of older white men. I want to share a story with you. You might not know, right? Like this is a hallowed university, et cetera, et cetera. And it was not easy for her when she came in 1980. A few of you know this story, and because I always keep it real, I'll share it with you. But she was in that office that I think you described, the number I'm forgetting, on the 10th floor, very early on, her first week, and a senior distinguished colleague from the economics department came into the office, began unzipping his pants, and it was sort of like a Harvey Weinstein experience. And my mom got out of there as fast as she could, thank God, complained to the dean at the time, who said, he's just like that, he's just like that. And many of us in this room know what that kind of response feels like. It feels pretty lousy. But that was just 1980, right? I mean, she fought patriarchy on every continent, right? She went, it was amazing. And yes, she was real classy and kind of quiet. It didn't cause I wouldn't say quiet. She didn't raise a stink when I would have, And I think if she wasn't angry in public, I think that rage that I definitely sensed from her mother, that grew in my mother, it finally landed in me. And I'm so proud of my rage. Because I look at my mother's life and all the crap she put up with, I'm like, oh my God, like how is that possible? I know that so many of you are fans of my dad, students of my dad, relatives of my dad. My dad is fantastic. And I never understood why everybody was always talking about my dad. I just didn't get it. I was like, my mom's the one who works twice as hard, and she runs the house, and she takes care of me, and she's the one who's like, she's just brilliant. I never understood. Nothing you could have told me about my dad's scholarship would change my mind. I'm like, no, my mother's the superhero. Like, guys, what are your I don't understand your standards. So she was it for me. We had a really turbulent relationship. She learned a lot from me. She was not prepared, raising a daughter like me in the United States. And I put her through the ringer. And, you know, the coolest thing about my mom was even in her 80s, even up to about last year, she was still learning. She was learning from me and my journey and trying to keep up, which is remarkable. You know, when she thought I was gay and was so outraged and so scared, and then a few years later was going to pride marches, right? Like on her own. I didn't hear about this until years later. For instance, she was constantly learning, trying to constantly connect. That was amazing. So as much as she loved her students, she was a student till the end, you know? What I really wanted to share with you was, I have had such an incredible opportunity these last few months. When my mom was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, I was out in San Francisco living the life. I think a life I wanted about 20 years ago, but it was delayed. And really reluctantly came back to New York City. I thought, oh, I'm done with New York City. And kind of took on this unwanted role of full-time caregiver, doing elder care, as they call it in the West. In India, it's just doing what you do. And I just started to fall in love with it. I was like, this is just such a gift. And I remember friends telling me, oh, like, you're, you know, this is so heroic, all this, you know, it was such strange language for me to hear because Mom was, like, I don't, you know, for those of you who have older parents or who are becoming those older parents, my parents are really cute, you know, and it's just like Sunil said, they were just, you know, sometimes like teenagers. My mom was 91 and she looked like a little girl. You know, I would play with her. I would play with her much like I would play with some, you know, my friend's 3-year-old child. And I mean that in the most respectful way possible. It was like just pure love, pure joy, pure presence. Just really there. And I just have such respect for like the ancient ways, for Asian culture, for Indian traditions. I had no idea. I had no idea because my mom left all of that for the United States. And here I am, you know, realizing, oh, I think I want some of that. I think I really want some of I really like my elders, you know. And so I've been doing that with my dad here, and it's been a gift. And I just urge you guys, you know, we grow up in the West, we think it's all about our accomplishments, I think. At least I'll speak for myself. You know, it's like the titles, the books you write, the accolades you get, the money you earn, maybe even the number of houses or kids you have. But at the end of the day, I think it's these really sticky relationships that are everything. I had no idea like this would be the thing that brings me so much fulfillment. You know, I've done some wacky things in my life, but like this is the thing. I'm so intrigued. And I kind of wish that gift on all of you, if you could make the time for your loved ones and, you know, mend the rifts and be with them, just be present, you know, forget the phones, forget the screens, have a conversation, find out what it was like back in 1940 in India, you know? I think, yeah, that's what I want to leave with you. My mother was, well, let me say this first. There's another piece to all of this, which often gets overlooked, and I could never overlook because it's such a huge part of my life right now, which is I haven't been doing this alone. My father stepped up to take care of my mom. It started several years ago. This is unheard of for any Indian man of his generation, but I'm almost sure that it's unheard of for most guys from our culture. I was amazed. He wouldn't leave her side for years, for months. He would just like sort of sacrifice his entire day just to be by her side, make sure she knew everything. She had everything she needed. It's beautiful. But there's also another part of this team which often gets forgotten, which is my mom was taken care of 24 hours a day by 3 extraordinary women, one named Ruby, one named Sylvia, and one named Janet. And they are extraordinarily generous, talented home care aides who have taught me so much about caring for other human beings, about respect, about dignity, and I mean, as far as my experience has gone, I mean, they're the true heroes, like in this entire sort of journey. It's remarkable. We owe our elders more, you know. We owe them so much more, and I'm so glad I got to be a part of this. Getting back to my mom, I thank you for listening to all of this. It's been a thick program. She truly believed, in order to compete with men, this was her phrase, in order to get ahead in life, you had to have your voice heard. You had to just throw your voice out there. Raise your hand and speak. Just raise your hand and speak. It doesn't matter what comes out. Just raise your hand and speak. Everyone's shy. Get over it. You can get over it. So I would like to invite you in that spirit, in open mic fashion. If you have any stories you want to share about Mom, any thoughts, any remembrances, she would love to have you come up and speak to all of us. I would love to have you. I would be happy to support you if you're feeling a little shy or hesitant. And I think, Vidyanti, you wanted to speak?
I'm one of those not on the list, and I promise I will not keep you more than a minute. I'm Vidya Deheja from Columbia's Art History Department, and I just wanted to share one of my many interactions with Padma. You've already heard about her autobiography. Soon after that autobiography was released, Padma said to me, Vidya, why don't we do a session at Columbia on my autobiography? Just you and me and the audience. And I thought to myself, wow, that is quite something. As you probably have gathered, it's the autobiography is an amazing piece of writing. And we did the evening. The questions were penetrating. She answered every one of them. She was one hell of a gutsy woman. She was really an inspiration to me, to women in general, not just Indian women, to women around the world. She was really a wonderful example. Thank you.
I'm Padma's niece, Pallavi Kotak Nee Desai, almost like her second daughter. I have a short poem for her, which I bring from her entire family in India. In the realm of numbers, she wove her love, Padma, our beloved, scholar of yore. From Surat's embrace to Harvard's door, her life a journey we deeply adore. A mind so bright in wisdom should steep. In the pages of Dostoevsky, her love ran deep. With Jagdish by her side, a bond so steep. Two hearts entwined, a lover to keep. Courageous and strong, a beacon of so bright. In the darkest hours, she was our light. Her journey a testament of sheer might. In our hearts, her memory ignites. Padma, dear Babufoi, in our hearts you'll stay. Your legacy lives on, lighting the way. It takes courage, and love's ballet will remember you each and every day. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is James Benedict. I first met Professor Desai in 1987. Came up for the PhD program in economics, and for God knows what reason, Professor Desai and Professor Bhagwati saw potential in me I didn't see in myself and took me in, and were like a family to me. I loved Professor Desai like a mother, and was incredibly blessed to have her in my life. And thank you, sir, and thank you, Anuradha, for letting me be a part of your lives. I'll share with you two memories. When I think about Professor Desai, I think about two things. One is her warmth and generosity, but the intentionality with which she applied that. She would go out of her way to meet students where they were, and whether it was give them a cup of coffee or buy them dinner, or I'm not sure if you know this, but your mom was one hell of a matchmaker. She was always setting students up on dates, and I think at least in our class, a couple of students actually got married from that. So. But it was that intentionality and that beautiful soul that cared about people and went out of her way to help them. And then I'd really be remiss if I didn't comment on the story Mike Woodford read about President Bollinger. So I was there, Sunil was there, we were sitting up on the steps, and for some bizarre reason, when you get an honorary degree, you can't speak. So Professor Bollinger gave Professor Desai the degree. He goes to take the podium back. She says, "Stand aside." Shoves him aside, grabs the podium as only she could. And yes, she did mention, giving money to Columbia, but it was really an aspirational speech. It was telling these kids, stay young, stay hungry, go out and change the world. And it ended with her saying, "Thank you, my fine friends," raising her hands. And then it was like the Pope or the Beatles had been there. The crowd erupts, and I'll have that memory of her hands held, smiling, and people's hearts moved by her words. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Lakshmi Bloom. My husband and I hosted the infamous party where Padma's hair caught fire. And she was incredibly calm. And David rushed over, I remember, with his hands banged out the flames. And then we took her into this other room, and she said, "I suppose people came expecting a Hindu wedding. Why not also a bride burning?" And I just made a joke out of it, but we were horrified. But everyone's been talking about how she inspired students, but I came to Columbia as a spouse who had just left work and had had a child, and I was feeling completely bereft, felt like I had no identity. And I'll never forget how Padma was so kind to me and said to me, "The greatest gift is to be a mother. I wasn't a mother till I was much older than you, so you should cherish this." And she said, "Just do it with all your heart. Other things will come. Don't worry." And she made me feel like the choice was okay. I never got to thank her for that. She did thank me for the party. She thanked me because she said it was really the only Hindu wedding that she and Jagdish had. But I never got to thank her, so I regret that.
Hi, Uncle. Hi. My name is Dahlia David. I had met Uncle and Auntie, who that's who they are to me, through Anuradha, because Anuradha and I had both gone to Natural Gourmet Institute, a school that deeply cares about how to nourish your body from the inside out. And Anu was looking for a chef that could take care of her parents in a very healthy way. And I'd come in from a perspective of, I'm just coming to cook and take care of these lovely people. I didn't know that years and years later, they would become like my second set of parents. And uncle and auntie often say, I'm from Kerala in India, and they say, you are our Malayali daughter. And that touches me so deeply. But more than anything else, my conversations with auntie throughout the years when I was cooking for them really kept me going with the work I did. I don't know how many of you know, but you don't find a lot of South Indian female chefs. So it was quite challenging with my own family structure. And, you know, it's not my parents' fault. They just are not used to this sort of experience that they're living through me, much like what Anuradha gave to her parents, right? It's a different sort of example, but challenging times for different sets of parents. But auntie constantly would tell me, there were moments when I would go to give her some dal, that was her favorite thing. There was one moment she'd grab my hand and she'd say, keep going, Dahlia, keep going, keep doing this. And she didn't know that those were the moments when I was having the hardest time with my career choices because, you know, running your own business is quite hard. And she really is a firm believer in supporting women reach their goals and do really hard things. And I was very lucky to be a part of their life. And I will say, when I would call, during the pandemic, I was living in California, and when I would call them, one of the things auntie would always say, because I made sure when I was there cooking with them, cooking for them and with them, I would check in their water intake because I knew when I wasn't there, they weren't drinking too much water. So it was like a goal of mine when I was cooking and there in their home to make sure they drank ample amounts of water. So when I would reach out during the pandemic, one of the first things she'd say is, yes, we're drinking water. And it was just a sweet thing that I always remember. But she changed my life. She is somebody that is quite very much in my head these days when I'm having a hard time, as I'm sure all of you guys that have been impacted by her have moments where you think about what she would do. So that's really a good question, right? What would Padma do? I'm very lucky to have known her and just want to share that.
Shruti Mishra. I was a student in the PhD economics program at Columbia. I got to know, I just graduated last year. I got to know Professor Desai primarily through Professor Bhagwati. And I'm going to share two memories about her that have shaped a lot of decisions in my life. The first one was from 7 years ago, when I was still an undergrad in Mumbai, and I was meeting Professor Bhagwati and Professor Desai were there in the city. I had known Professor Bhagwati, and I was meeting them for a lunch. The famous economist we knew back then in India was Professor Bhagwati, and I was going there, I went there all prepared with, his work on globalization. It was, to me, some kind of an interview that I thought I was going to have with him. And there I was surprised when Professor Desai, a female economist, a woman in a field which was still to some extent a man's world, she was the one who took over and questioned me on math, discussed math with me. And this is when I was still deciding if I was, capable of minoring in math or not. And that, for me, was a life-changing decision because that took me on the path of graduate studies in economics. A very small, it might not be the most significant thing, but to me, is to see a woman out there doing so well in math, surpassing her extremely famous husband, was a big thing for a young girl of 21 years. The second memory about her is from when I was already in the PhD program at Columbia. This was just, I think, last year. On her 91st, correct me if I'm wrong, birthday party, which was hosted at Professor Bhagwati and Professor Desai's place. Both of them, as everyone has mentioned, are one of the cutest couples anyone can ever come across. And so when Professor Bhagwati was talking about her, as multiple people have mentioned, he spoke about how it was, love at first sight for him, how she was so beautiful and so smart. And I have heard him say these things so many times. And then Professor Desai spoke a few words. To anyone who has spoken to her, and I have had the honor and privilege of having spoken to her and Professor Bhagwati a lot of times over the last 6-7 years, she adored Professor Bhagwati. But her words on her 91st birthday, she decided to speak about something which, again, I was at the juncture now of graduating from my PhD program and deciding what I wanted to do in life. She spoke about something which I think will always stay with me. This is one of the stories I don't think was shared today. She said that when she was deciding what to do within, economics, coming out of grad school, one of the many reasons, other than her fluency in Russian, that she took over the challenge of entering a field which was completely separate from what a lot of economists, and she mentioned this that day at her birthday party, her husband was doing. And she mentioned this with a lot of humility, that in a man's world, back in that time, she thought it was extremely important. It was a very conscious decision to make a name for herself, an identity which was separate from her husband's identity. And this is a woman who is also, I have known this when I came here in the first year, away from my parents. She's also one of the most compassionate women who will always check up on me. Do you have, my first winter here? Oh, the winters here are very different from India. You'll not be prepared for this. Do you have a coat? I'll take you shopping. That compassionate woman also has this side to her, this fierce will in herself to maintain her own identity. And that to me has been a very important life lesson, which I think I will always carry with me, that independence of thought and personality, feminism, and compassion and grace can walk together. She was an inspiration, and it was an honor and privilege to have known her. Thank you.
Almost 50 years ago, Professor Bhagwati got me a fellowship at MIT. And as soon as we landed here, Mrs. Bhagwati, she adopted us. She took care of us. She was very generous. She was our guide. And also, she was very witty. Everybody has heard that. But also, she had real insights into economic issues. I got a chance to learn something from her. As you know, Ukraine is a breadbasket, and we wanted to estimate some production functions. And usually, most of the researchers, they use a very easy Cobb-Douglas production function. But that has a lot of limitations, and also they don't incorporate that there are two things when you use like irrigation, that not only it changes the yield, increases the yield, but also it reduces the variability. So you have to take an additive term. Not simple log linear will not work. And the second thing is, Sure, you can take CES, constant elasticity of substitution, but even that has limitations because that changes over time. So how you incorporate that? So these two insights she gave me, and thanks to Professor Jerry Hausman, I knew how to estimate them. So we incorporate that, and even Professor Solo loved that, because CES, if you don't change over time the elastic substitution, that also gives inaccurate estimation. And finally, she always, whenever we met or talked, she was always asking me some good joke. And she was very witty, as we said. Maybe she might hear this the last time somewhere, and I'm going to say it, which I was going to tell her this time. One lady, she asked her husband, "How much do you love me?" He said that, "I love you as much as Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal, he loved his wife." So he said, "Would you make a Taj Mahal for me?" And he said that, "Yes, I've already bought the land. Only you are delaying it." Thank you.
If there's no one else who would like to share, we are having a reception at our place afterwards, and you are all welcome. It's 25 Claremont Avenue. Because I have the mic, I will share that it is labeled Peter Minuit, or Minuit, who is, as I discovered last night, once again after forgetting many years ago, the Dutch colonizer who bought Manhattan from the Lenape. Don't believe the fairy tale, guys. Yeah, we'll work to get his name off that building. But it's 25 Claremont Avenue, 10A, and many of us will be walking that way. It's about a 2.5 block walk. If you need transportation, if you are feeling exhausted or otherwise, there will be at least one vehicle going there as well. So just come find me if you are that person. Really, I want to thank the string quartet again, all our lovely friends. And Gary, that was beautiful. That was just stunning. Thank you for sharing, for being here, for being here to support my father especially, and me. And hopefully we'll see you in a few minutes at home. Amazing Gujarati food. For those of you who don't know the cuisine of Gujarat, we have a very special chef from Jackson Heights, Queens, who has made my father's favorite food. Okay, thanks, guys.
months.